Boeing was a symbol of innovation, engineering excellence, and American pride. Its planes connected the world, carried millions safely across the skies, and dominated the aviation industry. But behind the polished image, a darker story unfolded. Catastrophic failures, safety scandals, and corporate missteps that cost hundreds of lives. From deadly crashes to shocking manufacturing defects, whistleblower warnings, and government investigations, Boeing's reputation has taken a nosedive. How did a company built to soar end up crashing under the weight of its own failures? For decades, the company had one mission: to build the world's safest, most advanced aircraft. Every decision was guided by innovation and engineering excellence, ensuring passengers could confidently step onto a Boeing jet. But over time, something changed. Deadlines grew tighter, costs were cut, safety concerns were dismissed. It wasn't an accident, it was strategy. New leadership pushed aggressive business tactics, prioritizing speed and profit over precision. And at first, it worked. Boeing crushed competitors and secured billion-dollar deals. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. The company faced design flaws, rushed production, and ignored warnings. As these problems piled up, the company continued to push forward until the consequences became impossible to ignore. Fatal crashes, mass groundings, and investigations shook the company to its core. The world saw its failures, but few understood how it got to that point. Before the failures, before the scandals, before the name Boeing became synonymous with disaster, there was one man, one vision, and one defining moment. And that's where we begin. In 1916, inside a small shipyard in Seattle, a former timber merchant named William Boeing built his first airplane, a fragile wooden biplane held together with fabric. It wasn't the start of a business empire, just an experiment driven by curiosity. But when Boeing took that plane for a test flight, something clicked. He didn't just see a machine, he saw the future. Born in 1881 in Detroit, Michigan, he was the son of a German immigrant who made a fortune in the timber business. His father died when he was just 8 years old, leaving him a large inheritance. William grew up with access to elite education, engineering minds, and the business world. But Boeing, he wasn't just another privileged son, he had a restless drive to build. He left Yale before graduating and moved west to Washington State, seeing opportunities in timber, steel, and construction. In 1910, he attended an air show, watching early aircraft struggle through the sky. The designs were rough and the flights were unsteady, but he saw potential. In 1915, he bought his first seaplane to see how it worked, but when it needed repairs, he hit a problem. There were no replacement parts. That's when he made a decision that would define his legacy. I can build a better plane. He partnered with an engineer, George Conrad Westervelt, and they built the B&W seaplane together. It was rough, but it flew. That was all the proof William needed. In July 1916, he founded Pacific Aero Products Company, renaming it Boeing Airplane Company just a year later. However, even with the completion of his first plane, Boeing faced a harsh reality. No one was buying it. With the outbreak of World War I, aircraft shifted from luxury to necessity almost overnight. Boeing secured a military contract, producing 50 seaplanes for the US Navy. The war became his breakthrough. But when it ended in 1918, so did military contracts. Many aircraft manufacturers collapsed, but Boeing refused to follow. Instead, he adapted. By 1920, he pivoted to commercial aviation, focusing on a new opportunity: airmail. It wasn't glorious, but it kept the company alive. 7 years later, the business took a major leap forward when Boeing won a game-changing contract to transport US mail. This was no longer an experiment, it was an empire in the making. But as operations expanded, so did his ambitions, and soon, those ambitions would take the company in a direction even William Boeing couldn't have predicted. Building an aircraft is one thing, turning it into a global empire is another. The company had been built, but now it had to last. The 1927 Airmail contract was a turning point. What started as a strategy to stay afloat became the foundation for commercial air travel. To meet the growing demand, the company developed the Model 40, a lightweight, fast aircraft designed to carry both mail and passengers. It was practical, reliable, and exactly what the industry needed. But expansion didn't stop at building planes. Boeing moved into airplane operations, controlled key airmail routes, and even manufactured airplane engines, turning aviation into a fully integrated industry. In 1929, William Boeing took the next step, merging his company with other aviation firms to create United Aircraft and Transport Corporation. This powerful network controlled everything, from aircraft production to airline operations and even airport infrastructure. For the first time, one company shaped the entire future of flight. It was a brilliant business move, but it came at a cost. In 1934, under new antitrust laws, the government forced UATC to break apart, splitting the airplane empire into 3 separate companies. United Airlines took over passengers and mail operations. United Aircraft focused on engine and parts manufacturing, and what remained of Boeing Airplane Company would continue producing aircraft. The ruling shattered Boeing's empire. Furious and exhausted, William Boeing did something no one expected. He walked away. At just 53 years old, he left the company he'd built from the ground up and never returned to aviation. Boeing had survived wars, financial crashes, and fierce competition, but now, for the first time, it would have to survive without its founder. Losing its founder could have been the end, but it was just the beginning of something bigger. Forced to rebuild after the 1934 antitrust breakup, the company reinvented itself, shifting between warplanes, commercial airliners, and billion-dollar government deals. But with every expansion came new risks. It was no longer just an airplane manufacturer. It had grown into something much larger, a corporate giant with everything to lose. The timing couldn't have been better, as the company recovered from the breakup and World War II erupted, bringing an incredible demand for military aircraft. It answered with the B-17 Flying Fortress, a long-range bomber that became one of the war's most crucial weapons. And it didn't stop there. The newly developed B-29 Super Fortress would go on to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By 1945, Boeing was no longer just an aviation company, but a key player in global warfare. But when the war ended, so did the demand for bombers. Once again, a crisis emerged. What happens when your biggest customer, war itself, disappears? Well, Boeing bet everything on commercial airline. In 1958, it introduced the 707, the first American jetliner to reshape global air travel. Faster, bigger, and more efficient, it proved that the future belonged to jets. 10 years later, it launched the 737, a short-haul jet designed for quick turnarounds and efficiency. It became an instant success, eventually cementing itself as the most widely used airliner in the world. The success led to something even more ambitious, the Boeing 747, the queen of the skies. It was the largest commercial aircraft in history, capable of carrying hundreds of passengers across continents. It was a massive risk. The company poured so much money into the 747 that the entire business would have collapsed if it failed. But the gamble paid off, and Boeing became the undisputed aviation king. For decades, they dominated both commercial and military aviation. It supplied NASA, built Air Force One, and secured multi-billion-dollar defense contracts. Then, the company made a move that would change its future forever. It merged with McDonnell Douglas, a struggling aerospace firm known for cost-cutting and financial-first leadership. On paper, this seemed like a smart move, absorbing a major competitor and strengthening its hold on the industry. But in reality, this was the decision that would lead to Boeing's downfall. The new leadership, composed of former McDonnell Douglas executives, didn't share Boeing's engineering-first culture. Instead, they prioritized profits, stock value, and aggressive cost-cutting. It was a shift so subtle that few noticed at first, but behind the scenes, the company was changing. Boeing played the long game for decades, expanding, innovating, and crushing competition. But the moment it put profit over precision, everything started to collapse. A new leadership, a new philosophy, and a slow, steady descent into disaster. The collaboration between the two companies quickly reshaped the business. Their mission? Maximize shareholder value, slash costs, and boost production speed. To cut expenses, Boeing shifted from in-house manufacturing to outsourcing, relying on suppliers like Spirit Aerosystems to build key components, such as fuselages. But many of these suppliers had little to no experience with aircraft manufacturing. Parts arrived late, incomplete, or defective. forcing Boeing workers to correct mistakes instead of assembling planes. Santiago Paredes, a former quality manager at Spirit Aerosystems, revealed that he was pressured to downplay problems found during inspections, exposing serious quality control failures caused by relying on outside suppliers. This meant defects often went unnoticed until it was too late. And yet, leadership demanded faster production, tighter deadlines, and fewer delays. In the past, Boeing's engineers would have pushed back, but now those voices were drowned out by executives who only cared about the bottom line. By 2003, Boeing was losing its edge. For the first time, Airbus had overtaken it as the world's largest aircraft manufacturer. The pressure to reclaim dominance was enormous, and the answer came from its most ambitious project yet, the 787 Dreamliner. It was supposed to redefine aviation. Made from advanced composite materials, it promised better fuel efficiency, longer range, and lower operating costs. Airlines were sold on the vision, and before the first plane was even built, Boeing had secured over 800 orders. But there was a problem. To cut costs and speed up development, Boeing outsourced more than ever before. More than 70% of the Dreamliner's components came from external suppliers, many of whom had never built aircraft before. Key parts were assembled in factories in Italy, Japan, and South Carolina. However, instead of fully functioning sections arriving in Seattle, workers found themselves fixing incomplete and defective components just to keep production moving. The first Dreamliner was supposed to take flight in 2007. It didn't. Delays piled up as suppliers struggled to meet demands. The aircraft's complex new battery system caused multiple electrical failures, and by 2011, the Dreamliner was nearly 4 years behind schedule. Then, just as Boeing was scrambling to fix the Dreamliner's problems in August 2011, Airbus launched the A320neo, a more fuel-efficient version of its best-selling jet. It was a massive hit, and Boeing's customers wanted a response, fast. But there was another problem. Designing a new plane from scratch would take too long. The solution? Modify the existing 737 and call it the 737 MAX. While Boeing rushed the MAX into development, the Dreamliner finally entered service in October 2011, but things only got worse. In 2013, multiple Dreamliners caught fire mid-flight due to faulty lithium-ion batteries. The entire 787 fleet was grounded worldwide, the first time in history that an entire aircraft model had been pulled from service due to safety concerns. For Boeing, this should have been a wake-up call. Instead, it became a blueprint. Rather than address the deeper issues in its supply chain, Boeing doubled down on cost-cutting, rushing aircraft through production, and betting any problems could be fixed later. Meanwhile, engineers working on the 737 MAX were facing a new crisis. Placing the MAX's heavier engines higher on the wings made the plane unstable. Boeing's solution? A software fix. The company developed MCAS, a system that automatically pushed the nose down if it sensed the plane was stalling. Because the MAX's larger engines sat higher on the wings, they could cause the nose to rise too much during takeoff. MCAS was designed to correct this by adjusting the angle without pilot input. But there was a catch. Pilots weren't told how the software worked. Boeing downplayed the risks to regulators. No extra training was required because training meant additional costs. The 737 MAX was now in the air. Passengers had no idea what was coming. Boeing had already made its biggest mistake. They just didn't know it yet. On October 29, 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 took off from Jakarta, Indonesia, heading for Pangkal Pinang. It was a routine domestic flight on a brand new Boeing 737 MAX 8. Just 2 minutes after takeoff, the pilots noticed something was wrong. Their controls weren't responding as expected, and the aircraft's nose kept tilting downward on its own. The captain, Bave Saneja, pulled back to level the plane, but seconds later, the nose dipped again. This was MCAS in action, compensating for the 737 MAX's design flaws. A faulty angle of attack sensor tricked MCAS into believing the plane was stalling. To correct this imaginary stall, MCAS forced the nose down automatically. The pilots had no idea why this was happening. They weren't trained on this new software because Boeing never told them it existed, and the system wasn't even mentioned in the flight manual. For the next 11 minutes, the crew fought desperately. Each time they pulled up, MCAS activated again, pulling the plane lower and lower. At 6:33 a.m., Flight 610 slammed into the Java Sea at over 450 miles per hour. the aircraft disintegrated on impact, leaving no survivors among the 189 passengers and crew. When Boeing responded, they didn't mention MCAS. Instead, they blamed Lion Air's maintenance and the pilot's aircraft handling. Internally, however, everyone knew the truth. But instead of fixing the problem, they kept the 737 MAX in the skies, and 5 months later, it happened again. Another brand new 737 MAX, another routine flight. Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 took off from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, bound for Nairobi, Kenya. 6 minutes later, it was gone. The flight had barely reached 1,000 feet when the pilots, Captain Yared Getachew and First Officer Ahmed Nur Mohammed, noticed the aircraft behaving strangely. Like Lion Air 610, the nose began dipping down on its own. The crew struggled to level the aircraft, but MCAS activated again, forcing the nose down harder and faster. Now fully aware of what was happening, the pilots cut power to the system, trying to regain control. But it was too late. The aircraft plunged nearly 1,000 feet in just 5 seconds. At 8:44 a.m., Flight 302 crashed into the ground at over 500 miles per hour. The impact created a massive crater, scattering debris across a field near Bishoftu, Ethiopia. All 157 people on board, passengers, crew, entire families, lost their lives instantly. The 2 air crash disasters weren't accidents, they were betrayals. Families of the victims wanted answers. Aviation experts sounded the alarm. Then came the question no one could ignore. Why was the 737 MAX still flying? As investigators pieced together the crashes, one thing was clear. This was no coincidence. The same plane, the same flaw, the same deadly software forced pilots into a flight they could never win. On March 10, 2019, just hours after the Ethiopian Airlines crash, China grounded all 737 MAX aircraft. By the end of the week, the European Union, Canada, and nearly every other major aviation authority followed. However, the FAA refused in the United States, where Boeing was most powerful. Boeing defended the aircraft for 3 days, while the world shut down the 737 MAX. The FAA stood by its certification. Pilots were properly trained, they claimed. The plane was safe. It wasn't until March 13th, after intense pressure and new satellite data showing strange similarities between the 2 crashes, that the US finally grounded the aircraft. As pressure grew, the company's secrets began to surface. Leaked internal messages between employees revealed something chilling. In 2017, Boeing technical pilot Patrick Gustafson described the 737 MAX as designed by clowns who were supervised by monkeys. That was Boeing's engineers talking about the very aircraft that had killed hundreds of people. Worse, emails from 2016 exposed something even more shocking. Boeing's chief technical pilot for the 737 MAX, Mark Faulkner, had seen the problem firsthand. After a test flight in a flight simulator, he sent a message to a colleague, Vince Koval, saying, "MCAS is running rampant in the sim on me." He later added something even more chilling, "So I basically lied to the regulators." Koval reassured him, "It wasn't a lie. No one told us that was the case." But the truth was clear. Boeing had known about MCAS issues long before the crashes, and instead of fixing the problem, they covered it up. Meanwhile, congressional investigators dug deeper, and what they found was even worse. The House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure released a September 2020 report calling Boeing's actions a culture of concealment. Their findings: Boeing deliberately misled the FAA, knowing MCAS could activate repeatedly, but choosing not to inform pilots. Instead of addressing the flaw, Boeing withheld critical details from regulators, avoiding costly redesigns at the expense of safety. The company had a choice: safety or profit. They chose profit. By the end of 2019, the aircraft empire was crumbling. After months of denial, CEO Dennis Muilenburg was fired in December 2019. His replacement, David Calhoun, promised change, but by then, the damage was done. The company was facing lawsuits. In 2021, it agreed to a $2.5 billion settlement with the US Department of Justice, admitting that it had deceived regulators about MCAS. Yet, even after all of this, the crashes, the cover-ups, the lawsuits, Boeing still had a problem. For years, it insisted that the 737 MAX was safe. Regulators had cleared it, and airlines had placed new orders. The company was supposed to be past its darkest days. Then, 2024 began, and what happened next proved just how little things had changed. On January 5th, passengers on Alaska Airlines Flight 1282 braced for takeoff from Portland International Airport. The flight was supposed to be routine. Minutes after departure, a sudden, deafening explosion rocked the cabin. At 16,000 feet, a door plug, a panel used to plug an area reserved for an exit door, ripped away from the aircraft. The force of the decompression was instant. Oxygen masks dropped. A violent windstorm filled the cabin as a gaping hole appeared in the side of the plane. Passengers screamed, clutching their seats. Miraculously, no one was sitting in the row where the panel blew out. The aircraft turned around and landed safely. But the real shock came when investigators took a closer look. The door plug had never been properly bolted in place. Boeing had outsourced fuselage assembly to Spirit Aerosystems, a supplier already linked to quality control failures. And this wasn't a one-off mistake. Similar defects had been found on other aircraft. Within 24 hours, the FAA ordered emergency inspections of all 737 MAX 9 aircraft, and by January 6th, an official grounding order was in place. The decision marked one of the most serious regulatory actions against Boeing since the 737 MAX crisis began. The world was watching again, but 2024 wasn't done with Boeing yet. Just as the company scrambled to contain the fallout from the door plug disaster, another terrifying event unfolded. December 29, 2024, just days before the year ended, Jeju Air Flight 2216 was attempting to land at Muan International Airport in South Korea when disaster struck. At 900 feet, the aircraft lost power in both engines just moments before touchdown. It was an unstoppable descent. The plane overshot the runway, skidded, and burst into flames. 179 people lost their lives. Initial investigations pointed to a bird strike. A flock of birds may have struck the engines, causing them to fail. But aviation experts questioned why the engines had shut down entirely. Has Boeing's quality control played a role? Has cost-cutting made their aircraft more vulnerable? For Boeing, 2024 wasn't just a bad year. It was the year the world realized that the company's problems hadn't gone away, they had only gotten worse. At its peak, Boeing was worth over $250 billion. It was an aviation empire backed by governments, trusted by airlines, and seen as too big to fail. Now, that value has plunged to $105 billion, and it's still falling. Lawsuits, investigations, grounded planes, billions were lost in stock value. And yet, despite the crashes, the whistleblowers' warnings, the near misses, planes kept rolling off Boeing's production lines. Each time a door plug blows out mid-flight, each time pilots fight for control, each time a disaster is narrowly avoided, Boeing calls it an isolated incident. But how many isolated incidents does it take before it becomes the norm? The world trusted Boeing once, that trust is gone. And now, the only question left is, what happens when the skies are no longer safe, when the very planes meant to connect the world become symbols of fear? If history is any indication, the next failure isn't possible, it's inevitable.